His back was toward the door, but I could plainly perceive that the respirator had been removed from his mouth, and that the odious green goggles were raised. He was sitting, as it seemed, absolutely without motion, and his face was advanced close to that of the child. I stood looking at this group in a state of stupor for some seconds. He was, I suppose, conscious of my presence. For although he did not turn his head, or otherwise take any note of my arrival, he readjusted the muffler which usually covered his mouth, and lowered the clumsy spectacles to their proper place. The child was sitting upon his knee as motionless as he himself, with a countenance white and rigid as that of a corpse, and from which every trace of meaning, except some vague character of terror, had fled, and staring with a fixed and dilated gaze into his face. As it seemed, she did not perceive my presence. Her eyes were transfixed and fascinated. She did not even seem to me to breathe. Horror and anguish at last overcame my stupefaction. What is it?" I cried. "What ails my child, my darling child?" "I'd be glad to know, myself," he replied, coolly. "It is certainly something very queer." "What is it, darling?" I repeated, frantically, addressing the child. "What is it?" he reiterated. "Why, it's pretty plain, I should suppose, that the child is ill." "Oh merciful God!" I cried, half furious, half terrified. "You have injured her, you have terrified her. Give me my child, give her to me." These words I absolutely shouted, and stamped upon the floor in my horrid excitement. "Pooh, pooh," he said, with a sort of ugly sneer. "The child is nervous, you'll make her more so, be quiet and she'll probably find her tongue presently. I have had her on my knee some minutes." But the sweet bird could not tell what ails her. "Let the child go," I shouted in a voice of thunder. "Let her go. I say let her go." He took the passive, death-like child, and placed her standing by the window, and rising, he simply said, "As soon as you grow cool, you are welcome to ask me what questions you like. The child is plainly ill. I should not wonder if she had seen something that frightened her." Having thus spoken, he passed from the room. I felt as if I spoke, saw, and walked in a horrid dream. I seized the darling child in my arms, and bore her away to her mother. "What is it, for mercy's sake, what is the matter?" she cried, growing in an instant as pale as the poor child herself. I found that demon in the parlor with the child on his lap, staring in her face. She is manifestly terrified. "Oh, gracious God! She is lost, she is killed," cried the poor mother, frantically looking into the white, apathetic, meaningless face of the child. "Fanny, darling Fanny, tell us if you are ill," I cried, pressing the little girl in terror to my heart. "Tell your own mother, my darling," echoed my poor little wife. "Oh, darling, darling child, speak to your poor mother." It was all in vain. Still the same dilated, imploring gaze, the same pale face, wild and dumb. We brought her to the open window, we gave her cold water to drink, we sprinkled it in her face. We sent for the apothecary, who lived hard by, and he arrived in a few moments, with a parcel of tranquilizing medicines. These, however, were equally unavailing. Hour after hour passed away. The darling child looked upon us as if she would have given the world to speak to us, or to weep, but she uttered no sound. Now and then she drew a long breath as though preparing to say something. But still she was mute. She often put her hand to her throat, as if there was some pain or obstruction there. I never can, while I live, lose one line of that mournful and terrible portrait, the face of my stricken child. As hour after hour passed away, without bringing the smallest change or amendment, we grew both alarmed, and at length absolutely terrified for her safety. We called in a physician toward night, and told him that we had reason to suspect that the child had somehow been frightened, and that in no other way could we at all account for the extraordinary condition in which he found her. This was a man, I may as well observe, though I do not name him, of the highest eminence in his profession, and one in whose skill, from past personal experience, I had the best possible reasons for implicitly confiding. He asked a multiplicity of questions, the answers to which seemed to baffle his attempts to arrive at a satisfactory diagnosis. There was something undoubtedly anomalous in the case, and I saw plainly that there were features in it which puzzled and perplexed him not a little. At length, however, he wrote his prescription, and promised to return at 9 o'clock. I remember there was something to be rubbed along her spine, and some medicines beside. But these remedies were as entirely unavailing as the others. In a state of dismay and distraction we watched by the bed in which, in accordance with the physician's direction, we had placed her. The absolute changelessness of her condition filled us with despair. The day which had elapsed had not witnessed even a transitory variation in the dreadful character of her seizure. Any change, even a change for the worse, would have been better than this sluggish, hopeless monotony of suffering. At the appointed hour the physician returned. He appeared disappointed, almost shocked, at the failure of his prescriptions. On feeling her pulse he declared that she must have a little wine. There had been a wonderful prostration of all the vital powers since he had seen her before. He evidently thought the case a strange and precarious one. She was made to swallow the wine, and her pulse rallied for a time, but soon subsided again. I and the physician were standing by the fire, talking in whispers of the darling child's symptoms, and likelihood of recovery, when we were arrested in our conversation by a cry of anguish from the poor mother, who had never left the bedside of her little child, and this cry broke into bitter and convulsive weeping. The poor little child had, on a sudden, stretched down her little hands and feet, and died. There is no mistaking the features of death. The filmy eye and dropped jaw once seen, are recognized whenever we meet them again. Yet, spite of our belief, we cling to hope. And the distracted mother called on the physician, in accents which might have moved a statue, to say that her darling was not dead. Not quite dead, that something might still be done, that it could not be all over. Silently he satisfied himself that no throb of life still fluttered in that little frame. "It is, indeed, all over," he said, in tones scarce above a whisper. And pressing my hand kindly, he said, "Comfort your poor wife." And so, after a momentary pause, he left the room. This blow had smitten me with stunning suddenness. I looked at the dead child, and from her to her poor mother. Grief and pity were both swallowed up in transports of fury and detestation with which the presence in my house of the wretch who had wrought all this destruction and misery filled my soul. My heart swelled with ungovernable rage. For a moment my habitual fear of him was neutralized by the vehemence of these passions. I seized a candle in silence, and mounted the stairs. The sight of the accursed cat, flitting across the lobby, and the loneliness of the hour, made me hesitate for an instant. I had, however, gone so far, that shame sustained me. Overcoming a momentary thrill of dismay, and determined to repel and defy the influence that had so long awed me, I knocked sharply at the door, and, almost at the same instant, pushed it open, and entered our lodger's chamber. He had had no candle in the room, and it was lighted only by the darkness visible, that entered through the window. The candle which I held very imperfectly illuminated the large apartment. But I saw his spectral form floating, rather than walking, back and forward in front of the windows. At sight of him, though I hated him more than ever, my instinctive fear returned. He confronted me, and drew nearer and nearer, without speaking. There was something indefinably fearful in the silent attraction which seemed to be drawing him to me. I could not help recoiling, little by little. As he came toward me, and with an effort I said, "You know why I have come. The child, she's dead." "Dead, huh? Dead is she?" he said, in his odious, mocking tone. "Yes, dead," I cried, with an excitement which chilled my very marrow with horror. "And you have killed her, as you killed my other." "How? I killed her, eh? Ha, ha," he said, still edging nearer and nearer. "Yes, I say you," I shouted, trembling in every joint, but possessed by that unaccountable infatuation which has made men invoke, spite of themselves, their own destruction, and which I was powerless to resist, deny it as you may. "It is you who killed her, wretch, fiend. No wonder she could not stand the breath and glare of hell. And you are one of those who believe that not a sparrow falls to the ground without your Creator's consent," he said, with icy sarcasm, "and this is a specimen of Christian resignation, hey? You charge his act upon a poor fellow like me, simply that you may cheat the devil, and rave and rebel against the decrees of heaven, under pretense of abusing me. The breath and flare of hell. Eh? You mean that I removed this and these, touching the covering of his mouth and eyes successively, as I shall do now again, and show you there's no great harm in that." There was a tone of menace in his concluding words not to be mistaken. "Murderer and liar from the beginning, as you are, I defy you," I shouted, in a frenzy of hate and horror, stamping furiously on the floor. As I said this, it seemed to me that he darkened and dilated before my eyes. My senses, thoughts, consciousness grew horribly confused, as if some powerful, extraneous will were seizing upon the functions of my brain. Whether I were to be mastered by death, or madness, or possession, I knew not. But hideous destruction of some sort was impending. All hung upon the moment, and I cried aloud, in my agony, an adjuration in the name of the three persons of the Trinity, that he should not torment me. Stunned, bewildered, like a man recovered from a drunken fall, I stood, freezing and breathless, in the same spot, looking into the room, which wore, in my eyes, a strange, unearthly character. Mr. Smith was cowering darkly in the window, and, after a silence, spoke to me in a croaking, sulky tone, which was, however, unusually submissive. "Don't it strike you as an odd procedure to break into a gentleman's apartment at such an hour, for the purpose of railing at him in the coarsest language? If you have any charge to make against me, do so. I invite inquiry and defy your worst. If you think you can bring home to me the smallest share of blame in this unlucky matter, call the coroner, and let his inquest examine and cross-examine me, and sift the matter if, indeed, there is anything to be sifted to the bottom. Meanwhile, go you about your business, and leave me to mine. But I see how the wind sits. You want to get rid of me, and so you make the place odious to me. But it won't do, and if you take to making criminal charges against me, you had better look to yourself. For two can play at that game." There was a suppressed whine in all this, which strangely contrasted with the cool and threatening tone of his previous conversation. Without answering a word, I hurried from the room, and scarcely felt secure, even when once more in the melancholy chamber, where my poor wife was weeping. Miserable, horrible was the night that followed. The loss of our child was a calamity which we had not dared to think of. It had come, and with a suddenness enough to bereave me of reason. It seemed all unreal, all fantastic. It needed an effort to convince me, minute after minute, that the dreadful truth was so, and the old accustomed feeling that she was still alive, still running from room to room, and the expectation that I should hear her step and her voice, and see her entering at the door, would return. But still the sense of dismay, of having received some stunning, irreparable blow, remained behind, and then came the horrible effort, like that with which one rouses himself from a haunted sleep, the question, "What disaster is this that has befallen?" Answered, "Alas! But too easily, too terribly." Amidst all this was perpetually rising before my fancy the obscure, dilated figure of our lodger, as he had confronted me in his malign power that night. I dismissed the image with a shudder as often as it recurred, and even now, at this distance of time, I have felt more than I could well describe in the mere effort to fix my recollection upon its hated traits, while writing the passages I have just concluded. This hateful scene I did not recount to my poor wife. Its horrors were too fresh upon me. I had not courage to trust myself with the agitating narrative, and so I sat beside her. With her hand locked in mine, I had no comfort to offer but the dear love I bore her. At last, like a child, she cried herself to sleep the dull, heavy slumber of worn-out grief. As for me, the agitation of my soul was too fearful and profound for repose. My eye accidentally rested on the holy volume, which lay upon the table open, as I had left it in the morning. And the first words which met my eye were these: "For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, worketh for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory." This blessed sentence riveted my attention, and shed a stream of solemn joy upon my heart. And so the greater part of that mournful night, I continued to draw comfort and heavenly wisdom from the same inspired source. Next day brought the odious incident. The visit of the undertaker, the carpentry, upholstery, and millinery of death. Why has not civilization abolished these repulsive and shocking formalities? What has the poor corpse to do with frills, and pillows, and napkins, and all the equipage in which it rides on its last journey? There is no intrusion so jarring to the decent grief of surviving affection. No conceivable mummery more derisive of mortality. In the room which we had been so long used to call the nursery, now desolate and mute, the unclosed coffin lay, with our darling shrouded in it. Before we went to our rest at night we visited it. In the morning the lid was to close over that sweet face, and I was to see the child laid by her little brother. We looked upon the well-known and loved features, purified in the sublime serenity of death, for a long time, whispering to one another, among our sobs, how sweet and beautiful we thought she looked. And at length, weeping bitterly, we tore ourselves away. We talked and wept for many hours, and at last, in sheer exhaustion, dropped asleep. My little wife awaked me, and said, "I think they have come, the undertakers." It was still dark, so I could not consult my watch, but they were to have arrived early, and as it was winter, and the nights long, the hour of their visit might well have arrived. "What, darling, is your reason for thinking so?" I asked. "I am sure I have heard them for some time in the nursery," she answered. "Oh, dear, dear little Fanny. Don't allow them to close the coffin until I have seen my darling once more." I got up, and threw some clothes hastily about me. I opened the door and listened. A sound like a muffled knocking reached me from the nursery. "Yes, my darling," I said, "I think they have come. I will go and desire them to wait until you have seen her again." And, so saying, I hastened from the room. Our bedchamber lay at the end of a short corridor, opening from the lobby, at the head of the stairs. And the nursery was situated nearly at the end of a corresponding passage, which opened from the same lobby at the opposite side. As I hurried along, I distinctly heard the same sounds. The light of dawn had not yet appeared, but there was a strong moonlight shining through the windows. I thought the morning could hardly be so far advanced as we had at first supposed, but still. Strangely as it now seems to me, suspecting nothing amiss, I walked on in noiseless, slippered feet, to the nursery door. It stood half open. Someone had unquestionably visited it since we had been there. I stepped forward, and entered. At the threshold, horror arrested my advance. The coffin was placed upon trestles at the further extremity of the chamber, with the foot of it nearly towards the door. And a large window at the side of it admitted the cold luster of the moon full upon the apparatus of mortality, and the objects immediately about it. "I have been expecting your return," he said, with the design of saying something which it might have profited you to learn, "but now I apprehend it is too late. What a pity you are so violent and impatient. You would not have heard me. In all probability, this morning. You cannot think how cross-grained and intemperate you have grown since you became a saint, but that is your affair, not mine. You have buried your little daughter this morning. It requires a good deal of that new attribute of yours, faith, which judges all things by rule of contraries, and can never see anything but kindness in the worst afflictions which malignity could devise. To discover benignity and mercy in the torturing calamity which has just punished you and your wife for nothing. But I fancy that it will be harder still when I tell you what I more than suspect. Ha! It would be really ridiculous, if it were not heart-rending, that your little girl has been actually buried alive. Do you comprehend me? Alive. For, upon my life, I fancy she was not dead as she lay in her coffin. I knew the wretch was exulting in the fresh anguish he had just inflicted. I know not how it was, but any announcement of disaster from his lips seemed to me to be necessarily true. Half stifled with the dreadful emotions he had raised, palpitating between hope and terror, I rushed frantically back again, the way I had just come, running as fast as my speed could carry me, toward the, alas, distant burial ground where my darling lay. I stopped a cab slowly returning to town, at the corner of the lane, sprang into it, directed the man to drive to the church of, and promised him anything and everything for dispatch. The man seemed amazed, doubtful, perhaps, whether he carried a maniac or a malefactor. Still he took his chance for the promised reward, and galloped his horse, while I, tortured with suspense, yelled my frantic incentives to further speed. At last, in a space immeasurably short, but which to me was protracted almost beyond endurance, we reached the spot. I hallooed to the sexton, who was now employed upon another grave, to follow me. I myself seized a mattock, and in obedience to my incoherent and agonized commands, he worked as he had never worked before. The crumbling mold flew swiftly to the upper soil, deeper and deeper, every moment. Grew the narrow grave at last, I sobbed, thank God, as I saw the face of the coffin emerge. A few seconds more and it lay upon the sward beside me, and we both, with the edges of our spades, ripped up the lid. There was the corpse, but not the tranquil statue I had seen it last. Its knees were both raised, and one of its little hands drawn up and clenched near its throat, as if in a feeble but agonized struggle to force up the superincumbent mass. The eyes, that I had last seen closed, were now open, and the face no longer serenely pale, but livid and distorted. I had time to see all in an instant. The whole scene reeled and darkened before me, and I swooned away. When I came to myself, I found that I had been removed to the vestry room. The open coffin was in the aisle of the church, surrounded by a curious crowd. A medical gentleman had examined the body carefully and had pronounced life totally extinct. The trepidation and horror I experienced were indescribable. I felt like the murderer of my own child. Desperate as I was of any chance of its life, I dispatched messengers for no less than 3 of the most eminent physicians then practicing in London. All concurred the child was now as dead as any other, the oldest tenant of the churchyard. Notwithstanding which, I would not permit the body to be reinterred for several days, until the symptoms of decay became unequivocal, and the most fantastic imagination could no longer cherish a doubt. This, however, I mention only parenthetically, as I hasten to the conclusion of my narrative. The circumstance which I have last described found its way to the public, and caused no small sensation at the time. I drove part of the way home, and then discharged the cab, and walked the remainder. On my way, with an emotion of ecstasy I cannot describe, I met the good being to whom I owed so much. I ran to meet him, and felt as if I could throw myself at his feet, and kiss the very ground before him. I knew by his heavenly countenance he was come to speak comfort and healing to my heart. With humbleness and gratitude, I drank in his sage and holy discourse. I need not follow the gracious and delightful exposition of God's revealed will and character with which he cheered and confirmed my faltering spirit. A solemn joy, a peace and trust streamed on my heart. The wreck and desolation there lost their bleak and ghastly character, like ruins illuminated by the mellow beams of a solemn summer sunset. In this conversation, I told him what I had never revealed to anyone before: the absolute terror, in all its stupendous and maddening amplitude, with which I regarded our ill-omened lodger, and my agonized anxiety to rid my house of him. My companion answered me, "I know the person of whom you speak. He designs no good for you or any other. He, too, knows me, and I have intimated to him that he must now leave you, and visit you no more. Be firm and bold, trusting in God, through his Son, like a good soldier, and you will win the victory from a greater and even worse than he, the unseen enemy of mankind. You need not see or speak with your evil tenant any more. Call to him from your hall, in the name of the Most Holy, to leave you bodily, with all that appertains to him, this evening. He knows that he must go, and will obey you. But leave the house as soon as may be yourself. You will scarce have peace in it. Your own remembrances will trouble you, and other minds have established associations within its walls and chambers too." These words sounded mysteriously in my ears. Let me say here, before I bring my reminiscences to a close, a word or two about the house in which these detested scenes occurred, and which I did not long continue to inhabit. What I afterwards learned of it seemed to supply in part a dim explanation of these words. In a country village there is no difficulty in accounting for the tenacity with which the sinister character of a haunted tenement cleaves to it. Thin neighborhoods are favorable to scandal, and in such localities the reputation of a house, like that of a woman, once blown upon, never quite recovers. In huge London, however, it is quite another matter, and, therefore, it was with some surprise that, 5 years after I had vacated the house in which the occurrences I have described took place, I learned that a respectable family who had taken it were obliged to give it up, on account of annoyances, for which they could not account, and all proceeding from the apartments formerly occupied by our lodger. Among the sounds described were footsteps restlessly traversing the floor of that room, accompanied by the peculiar tapping of the crutch. I was so anxious about this occurrence, that I contrived to have strict inquiries made into the matter. The result, however, added little to what I had at first learned, except, indeed, that our old friend, the cat, bore a part in the transaction as I suspected, for the servant, who had been placed to sleep in the room, complained that something bounded on and off, and ran to and fro along the foot of the bed, in the dark. The same servant, while in the room, in the broad daylight, had heard the sound of walking, and even the rustling of clothes near him, as of people passing and repassing, and, although he had never seen anything, he yet became so terrified that he would not remain in the house, and ultimately, in a short time, left his situation. These sounds, attention having been called to them, were now incessantly observed, the measured walking up and down the room, the opening and closing of the door, and the teasing tap of the crutch. All these sounds were continually repeated, until at last, worn out, frightened, and worried, its occupants resolved on abandoning the house. At the foot of the coffin stood the ungainly form of our lodger. He seemed to be intently watching the face of the corpse, and was stooped a little, while with his hands he tapped sharply, from time to time at the sides of the coffin, like one who designs to awaken a slumberer. Perched upon the body of the child, and nuzzling among the grave clothes, with a strange kind of ecstasy, was the detested brute, the cat I have so often mentioned. The group thus revealed, I looked upon but for one instant. In the next I shouted, in absolute terror, "In God's name, what are you doing?" Our lodger shuffled away abruptly, as if disconcerted, but the ill-favored cat, whisking round, stood like a demon sentinel upon the corpse, growling and hissing, with arched back and glaring eyes. The lodger, turning abruptly toward me, motioned me to one side. Mechanically I obeyed his gesture, and he hurried hastily from the room. Sick and dizzy, I returned to my own chamber. I confess I had not nerve to combat the infernal brute, which still held possession of the room, and so I left it undisturbed. This incident I did not tell to my wife until some time afterwards, and I mention it here because it was, and is, in my mind associated with a painful circumstance which very soon afterwards came to light. That morning I witnessed the burial of my darling child. So and desolate was my heart. But with infinite gratitude to the great controller of all events, I recognized in it a change which nothing but the Spirit of all good can effect. The love and fear of God had grown strong within me. In humbleness I bowed to His awful will. With a sincere trust I relied upon the goodness, the wisdom, and the mercy of Him who had sent this great affliction. But a further incident connected with this very calamity was to test this trust and patience to the uttermost. It was still early when I returned, having completed the last sad office. My wife, as I afterwards learned, still lay weeping upon her bed. But somebody awaited my return in the hall, and opened the door, anticipating my knock. This person was our lodger. I was too much appalled by the sudden presentation of this abhorred spectre even to retreat, as my instinct would have directed. Through the open door, about 4 years since, having had occasion to visit the capital, I resolved on a ramble by Old Brompton, just to see if the house was still inhabited. I searched for it, however, in vain, and at length, with difficulty, ascertained its site, upon which now stood 2 small, staring, brand-new brick houses, with each a gay enclosure of flowers. Every trace of our old mansion, and, let us hope, of our mysterious lodger, had entirely vanished. Let me, however, return to my narrative where I left it. Discoursing upon heavenly matters, my good and gracious friend accompanied me even within the outer gate of my own house. I asked him to come in and rest himself, but he would not, and before he turned to depart, he lifted up his hand and blessed me and my household. Having done this, he went away. My eyes followed him till he disappeared, and I turned to the house. My darling wife was standing at the window of the parlor. There was a seraphic smile on her face, pale, pure, and beautiful as death. She was gazing with an humble, heavenly earnestness on us. The parting blessing of the stranger shed a sweet and hallowed influence on my heart. I went into the parlor, to my darling. Childless she was now. I had now need to be a tender companion to her. She raised her arms in a sort of transport, with the same smile of gratitude and purity, and, throwing them round my neck, she said, "I have seen him, it is he, the man that came with you to the door, and blessed us as he went away is the same I saw in my dream, the same who took little baby in his arms, and said he would take care of him, and give him safely to me again." More than a quarter of a century has glided away since then. Other children have been given us by the good God, children who have been, from infancy to maturity, a pride and blessing to us. Sorrows and reverses, too, have occasionally visited us, yet, on the whole, we have been greatly blessed. Prosperity has long since ended all the cares of the res angusta domi, and expanded our power of doing good to our fellow creatures. God has given it, and God, we trust, directs its dispensation in our children, and would you think it, our grandchildren, too. The same beneficent God has given us objects that elicit and return all the delightful affections, and exchange the sweet converse that makes home and family dearer than aught else, save that blessed home where the Christian family shall meet at last. The dear companion of my early love and sorrows still lives, blessed be heaven. The evening tints of life have fallen upon her, but the dear remembrance of a first love, that never grew cold, makes her beauty changeless for me. As for your humble servant, he is considerably her senior, and looks it. Time has stolen away his raven locks, and given him a chevelure of snow instead. But, as I said before, I and my wife love, and, I believe, admire one another more than ever. And I have often seen our elder children smile archly at one another, when they thought we did not observe them, thinking, no doubt, how like a pair of lovers we two were.